The Bechtel family represents America's largest and most secretive private engineering dynasty. It was founded by Warren A. Bechtel in 1898, who began with nothing but a team of mules paving railroads in the American West. Today, after 5 generations of unbroken family control, his descendant Brendan Bechtel commands a global EPC, engineering, procurement, and construction, Goliath. With $22 billion in 2023 revenue, the Bechtel Corporation has executed over 25,000 megaprojects in 160 countries, making it a shadow government with the power to build or rebuild entire nations. Their immense privately held fortune, estimated by Forbes at over $15 billion, was forged from the critical infrastructure of the 20th century. After building railroads, the company pivoted to master oil and nuclear power. This includes the massive Trans-Arabian Pipeline in 1947, and most critically, the Hanford site for the Manhattan Project, the secret facility they helped build that processed the plutonium for the Nagasaki bomb. This contract established the deep symbiotic and often hidden relationship with the U.S. government that defines the company. The Bechtel story is one of stark, irreconcilable paradox. They are the celebrated architects of modern wonders, from the Hoover Dam and the Channel Tunnel to the $100 billion Jubail industrial city in Saudi Arabia. Yet their record is shadowed by accusations of being the contractor of every war, profiting from $2.3 billion in no-bid contracts after the Iraq invasion. Their history is defined by a revolving door of executives like George Shultz and Caspar Weinberger, who left the Bechtel boardroom to run the U.S. State and Defense Departments, and by global crises like the bloody Bolivia water war and the catastrophic ongoing nuclear waste leaks at Hanford. The Bechtel dynasty shadow was cast from its very foundation. Warren A. Bechtel, the son of an Illinois farmer, began in 1898 by building railroads for the Southern Pacific, profiting from the brutal expansion of the American West. Labor historians note that Western railroad contractors of that era frequently relied on exploited Chinese and Mexican immigrant laborers who faced low pay and lethal working conditions. Such practices were common in the region where Bechtel began his operations. When his son, Stephen Bechtel Sr., took control in 1933, he elevated this strategy from simple labor exploitation to high-stakes political maneuvering. He secured the massive Hoover Dam contract as part of the 6 companies consortium, a project that, according to 1930s government inquiries, was rife with allegations of bribery, corruption, and a $10 million cost overrun. This success led to a darker, more secretive partnership. In 1943, Bechtel was awarded the contract to build the Hanford site, the facility that processed the plutonium for the Nagasaki bomb. While a triumph of engineering, the project's legacy, as revealed by EPA studies decades later, was catastrophic radioactive contamination, elevated cancer rates for 300,000 local residents, and the creation of the most toxic place in the Western Hemisphere. During this same period, Stephen Sr. worked closely with the OSS, the precursor to the CIA, providing vital intelligence from his Middle East projects, cementing the company's role as a shadow arm of American foreign policy. To sanitize this emerging reputation, the family established the Bechtel Foundation in the 1950s, funneling hundreds of millions into education and environmental causes. Stephen Jr. advised President Eisenhower, shaping the massive interstate highway system. But this clean image was a facade, concealing a consistent pattern of corruption, such as later allegations of bribery to secure nuclear projects in South Korea, which were handled with a quiet internal fine to avoid public scrutiny. When World War II ended, America stood alone as the world's new undisputed superpower. It had the industrial might, the financial capital, and the atomic bomb that Bechtel itself had helped to build. But an empire, to be sustainable, must be built. It needs roads, ports, pipelines, and power plants. And so in the dawn of this new American century, Stephen Bechtel Sr., who had taken the reins after his father Warren's death, transformed the family company. He moved it beyond dams and railroads. He envisioned a corporation that would be the American empire's official private sector construction crew. The results were astronomical. The growth was not just fast, it was exponential, a post-war explosion that dwarfed its competitors. According to Bechtel's own financial reports, a company that was already large, posting $100 million in revenue in 1945, would grow tenfold to become a $1 billion a year Goliath by 1960. This new empire was built on projects so vast they defied imagination. They were not just feats of engineering, they were acts of geopolitical will. The first and most defining was a monument of ice and steel, the Trans-Alaska Pipeline. By the late 1960s, America was facing an energy crisis, and it desperately needed the vast oil reserves locked beneath the Arctic tundra of Alaska's North Slope. The problem was building an 800-mile-long pipeline across one of the most hostile environments on Earth. It was a project that had to cross 3 mountain ranges and hundreds of rivers, all while contending with permafrost that would turn a hot oil pipeline into a river of mud. It was deemed impossible by many, but for Bechtel, it was the perfect challenge. From 1968 to 1977, Bechtel, as the lead contractor in a consortium, managed this $8 billion Goliath. It was at the time the largest and most expensive private construction project in human history. When the oil finally flowed in 1977, the pipeline was delivering 2 million barrels of oil per day, a staggering 20% of America's entire domestic production. Bechtel had not just built a pipeline, it had secured America's energy independence, and in doing so, it had made itself indispensable to the U.S. government. But if Alaska proved Bechtel's mastery over nature, their next project would prove their mastery over society itself. In 1975, the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, flush with unimaginable oil wealth from the recent energy crisis, had a vision. They didn't just want a new port or a new factory. They wanted an entire industrial city built from scratch on the empty, scorching sands of the Persian Gulf. They called Bechtel. The project was Jubail Industrial City. It is impossible to overstate the scale of this endeavor. It was not a construction project. It was nation building. Bechtel was hired to be the master planner and manager, to turn an empty patch of desert into what is today the largest industrial metropolis in the world. Over its lifetime, the project's cost has swelled past $100 billion. Bechtel designed and built the ports, the steel mills, the petrochemical plants, the refineries, the international airport, and the desalination plants. They built the hospitals, the schools, and the homes for a new population of 500,000 people. Jubail was the new model. Bechtel had proven it could do what no other company and few governments could do: build an entire functioning 21st century city. How did one company, a secretive family-owned firm, achieve such utter dominance? It wasn't just because they were good builders. It was because they had perfected a two-pronged strategy: ruthless business efficiency and unparalleled political access. The first tactic was vertical integration. Bechtel's competitors, like Fluor or KBR, often had to subcontract major parts of a project. Bechtel did not. As industry analyses from the 2000s note, Bechtel controlled everything. They did the initial economic feasibility studies. They did the architectural and engineering designs. They procured the steel, the concrete, and the turbines. And their own crews, under their own management, did the construction. This closed loop gave them a killer advantage, allowing them to cut costs by an estimated 15 to 20% compared to their rivals. They could underbid any competitor, secure in the knowledge that they would make their profit by controlling every single nut, bolt, and dollar. This model made them efficient, but it was the second tactic that made them truly powerful. It was a new, more subtle form of power, a shadowy nexus of business and politics that would come to be known as the revolving door. Stephen Bechtel Jr., who took the helm in 1960, understood that the real money wasn't in competing for contracts. It was in creating the contracts. It was in having friends in high places who shared your worldview, who believed that what was good for Bechtel was good for America, and what was good for America was good for the world. The company began to actively recruit from the highest echelons of government, and more importantly, to send its own executives into government. This strategy reached its absolute zenith in the 1980s with the election of Ronald Reagan. The Bechtel cabinet, as it came to be known, was a stunning display of this revolving door. The first key figure was Caspar Weinberger. Weinberger, who had served as Bechtel's vice president and general counsel, was appointed by Reagan in 1981 to be the Secretary of Defense. The man who had been Bechtel's top lawyer was now in charge of the largest military budget in history. But the real prize was George Shultz. Shultz was not just a Bechtel employee. He was the president of Bechtel Corporation from 1974 to 1982. He was the man who had overseen the massive, lucrative expansion in Saudi Arabia. In 1982, Ronald Reagan asked him to leave his multi-million-dollar post at Bechtel to become the Secretary of State. The man who had been Bechtel's CEO was now the chief diplomat of the United States, the architect of all American foreign policy. This was not a conflict of interest. It was the interest. The lines were not blurred. They were erased. The men making U.S. foreign policy in the Middle East and the men running the U.S. military were the same men who had just months before been running the largest construction firm in the Middle East. The effect of this Bechtel cabinet was immediate and profound. It wasn't a matter of Bechtel's executives making secret phone calls to their old friends in government. They were the government. When Secretary of State George Shultz traveled to the Middle East to negotiate foreign policy, he was meeting with the same Saudi ministers and emirs with whom he had previously negotiated Bechtel's billion-dollar construction contracts at Jubail. His policy, which favored stable U.S. relations with oil-producing allies, was perfectly aligned with Bechtel's business model, which thrived on building massive infrastructure for those same allies. There was no conspiracy because no conspiracy was needed. The goals of the State Department and the goals of the Bechtel Corporation had become one and the same. This alignment was not always benign. It was a strategy that created and armed future conflicts. In 1988, as the Iran-Iraq War was nearing its end, Caspar Weinberger's Defense Department was actively supporting Saddam Hussein's Iraq as a bulwark against Iran. The U.S. government provided Saddam with intelligence, financial aid, and the dual-use technology he needed to build his chemical weapons arsenal. Simultaneously, as documented by the Nautilus Institute, Bechtel was in negotiations for a $1 billion contract to help build a massive chemical plant near Baghdad. The political and military establishment, run by former Bechtel men, was creating the very geopolitical conditions that their former company could profit from. The revolving door had become a perfect, self-enriching circle. This was the Bechtel way, perfected by Stephen Bechtel Sr. and Jr. The company's leaders, as detailed in Simon Johnson's book Friends in High Places, were not just builders, they were members of the exclusive all-male Bohemian Club. In this private forest retreat, Stephen Bechtel Sr. had mingled with presidents, CIA directors, and the CEOs of America's largest corporations. This was not just a social club, it was a shadow government, a place where the elite consensus was formed, where the men who ran the country and the men who built the country could speak freely. It was here that the lines between public service and private profit were not just blurred, they were actively erased. This political access strategy was so successful, it created an aura of invincibility. It allowed Bechtel to operate in a gray zone, often above the law, but it also laid the groundwork for their most significant legal and moral challenges. The company's reliance on high-level connections and its comfort in dealing with dictators and monarchs made it a target for accusations of bribery and corruption long before the Iraq War. As early as 1984, the company was internally penalized for bribery allegations in South Korea related to securing its lucrative nuclear projects. According to the Nautilus Institute, this was handled with a quiet internal fine, a slap on the wrist designed to avoid public scrutiny. These incidents, while kept quiet, were a preview of a business model that operated beyond the reach of normal accountability, a model that would later be scrutinized under the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act. This model, however, was about to evolve. By the 1990s, the era of trillion-dollar government spending on new infrastructure was waning. The Cold War was over. The big dams were built. The interstate highways were complete. To continue its exponential growth, Bechtel needed a new market. They found it in a new, insidious ideology: privatization. The new business tactic was no longer just about building new things for governments. It was about owning the things that already existed. It was about taking public services, water, power, transportation, and turning them into private for-profit monopolies. And their friends in government, particularly in Washington and at global institutions like the World Bank, were championing this new neoliberal model. They pushed developing nations to privatize their essential services as a condition for receiving loans. And who was the only company in the world with the expertise to run a city's entire water system, its power grid, and its airport? Bechtel. This new strategy reached its disastrous climax in 1999 in the city of Cochabamba, Bolivia. Bechtel, as the head of a consortium called Aguas del Tunari, was granted a massive 40-year concession to take over the city's entire public water system. The contract, negotiated in secret with a pliant local government, was a masterpiece of corporate self-interest. To recoup their investment of $200 million, the contract guaranteed them a 16% annual profit, adjusted for inflation. To achieve this, Bechtel's consortium immediately raised the water rates, not by a little. According to reports from the World Bank and citizen groups, the price of water for the poorest residents of Cochabamba exploded, in some cases by over 200%. This was not a luxury item. This was water. Families earning less than $100 a month were suddenly handed water bills for $20. It was a choice between eating and drinking. The company's business tactic, which looked so clean on a balance sheet, had become an act of extortion. This decision would light a fire that would engulf the entire nation. The rise of Bechtel was now complete. It had evolved from a simple construction firm into a three-headed giant. The first head was a peerless engineering force capable of building wonders like the Channel Tunnel, which it began work on in 1986. The second head was a political shadow state with a revolving door that fused its interests with those of the American government. And the third, new head, was that of a private monopolist, one that had found a new way to profit not by building, but by simply owning the most basic elements of human survival. This was the company that, in 2003, would be seen as the only logical choice to rebuild Iraq. It was a company that had perfected every tactic of power, from vertical integration to political integration, from building empires to owning the water people drink. While the disastrous privatization experiment in Bolivia was unfolding, Bechtel was simultaneously putting the finishing touches on a project that cemented its reputation as the master of the impossible. This was the Channel Tunnel. For centuries, it had been the dream of engineers, a tunnel beneath the English Channel, physically connecting Great Britain to mainland Europe. It was a project fraught with political, financial, and geological peril. In 1986, Bechtel was brought on as a key management contractor for the $15 billion, or $21 billion in adjusted figures, mega project. This was not a job for a normal company. It involved managing a consortium of international banks, two governments with a historically tense relationship, and the unprecedented engineering challenge of digging a 50-kilometer tunnel through a geologically complex bed of chalk marl, all while under the constant threat of water ingress from the sea above. Bechtel's role was essential. Their vertical integration model was put to the test, coordinating the design, procurement, and operation of the massive tunnel boring machines. When the project was completed in 1994, it was hailed as one of the 7 wonders of the modern world. Bechtel had once again done what no one else could. The Trans-Alaska Pipeline, the city of Jubail, and the Channel Tunnel formed a holy trinity of Bechtel's capabilities. They could conquer the Arctic, they could build a city from sand, and they could tunnel under the ocean. By the mid-1990s, their dominance was absolute. They had become the default go-to company for any project on Earth that was too big, too complex, or too politically sensitive for anyone else. But this rise, built on political access and sheer scale, was not without its legal and moral rot. The Bechtel cabinet of Schultz and Weinberger had created an aura of invincibility, but it also fostered a corporate culture of entitlement, a belief that the company operated in a special, privileged zone above the laws that governed mere mortals. This culture was repeatedly exposed in a series of damaging, if often overlooked, legal scandals that defined their rise. The company's global expansion, which looked so impressive on paper, was often greased by tactics that were, at best, unethical and, at worst, criminal. The most glaring examples came from their dealings in securing high-stakes contracts. In the 1980s, as Bechtel was expanding its lucrative nuclear power plant construction business, South Korea was a key target. According to a 2003 report from the Nautilus Institute, Bechtel's pursuit of these contracts was tangled in a web of illicit payments. The company was accused of using its network to funnel bribes to officials in the government of Park Chung-hee to secure the projects. The scandal was a direct violation of the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, FCPA, a 1977 law passed by the U.S. Congress precisely to stop American companies from bribing foreign officials. The FCPA was a direct threat to Bechtel's business model, which relied on personal relationships with the potentates and officials of client states. Bechtel's response to the allegations was a masterclass in its own brand of damage control. Rather than face a public trial, the company, according to reports, quietly settled the matter, paying an internal fine and handling the matter outside of public view. They had treated a federal anti-bribery law as a simple cost of doing business. This pattern was repeated elsewhere. In Egypt, as detailed by investigative reports, Bechtel was accused of using similar tactics to secure contracts related to the expansion of the Suez Canal in the 1990s. The allegations fit the familiar pattern, using its deep state connections to get in the door, and then using its financial muscle to lubricate the bureaucratic process. These incidents, while not as explosive as the later Iraq scandal, were critical. They set the legal precedent for how Bechtel would operate. The FCPA, a law designed to rein in companies like Bechtel, had instead taught them a valuable lesson. Don't get caught. It pushed their tactics further into the shadows, relying on a complex network of subsidiaries, local consultants, and the legal protection of their revolving door executives. This was the company by the turn of the 21st century. It was an engineering colossus, celebrated for its modern wonders. It was a political powerhouse with a shadow cabinet of former executives running American foreign policy. It was a newly minted monopolist, pioneering the privatization of human necessities like water. And it was a legally battle-hardened corporation, one that had learned to navigate anti-corruption laws as just another engineering obstacle. This was the company that in 2003 would be seen by the Bush administration as the only logical, trusted, and patriotic choice to be handed the $680 million no-bid contract to rebuild Iraq. It was a company that had perfected every tactic of power, from vertical integration to political integration, from building empires to owning the water people drink. The stage was set for its greatest and most disastrous performance. The 2003 invasion of Iraq was not just a military operation, it was a business plan. Long before the first shock and awe bombs fell on Baghdad, a parallel campaign was being waged in the halls of power in Washington. This was the campaign for the Reconstruction, the immensely lucrative taxpayer-funded effort to rebuild the country that the U.S. military was about to destroy. And at the center of this plan, from the very beginning, was the Bechtel Corporation. The company's political groundwork, laid decades earlier by the revolving door, had placed it in the perfect position. The intellectual authors of the war, the neoconservatives in the George W. Bush administration, were the ideological children of men like George Shultz and Caspar Weinberger. Stephen Bechtel Jr. himself was a member of the same exclusive, secretive circles, like the Bohemian Grove, as the president's father, George H.W. Bush. As documented in books like The Bechtel Scandal, these were not distant acquaintances. They were members of the same class sharing the same worldview. They believed in the power of American corporations to remake the world, and Bechtel was their chosen instrument. Bechtel wasn't just a contractor. It was the contractor. It was seen as an essential private sector arm of the American government. The only firm on earth with the scale, the expertise, and, most importantly, the political trust to be handed the keys to an entire nation's infrastructure. The process for a contract of this size was a masterpiece of corporate cronyism. In April 2003, just as Baghdad was falling, the U.S. Agency for International Development, USAID, announced the winner of the primary contract for rebuilding Iraq's infrastructure. It was Bechtel. The contract was awarded not through a competitive public bidding process, but through a no-bid or limited competition selection. The other bidders were given just days to prepare proposals for a multi-billion-dollar project, an impossible deadline. The outcome was preordained. The initial amount was $680 million. This was the first act of the financial tragedy. The U.S. government, in its haste to reward its chosen partner, had bypassed the very free market principles it claimed to be bringing to Iraq. The contract was a cost-plus agreement, the most notorious and wasteful type of government contract. This meant that Bechtel would be paid for all its costs, plus a guaranteed pre-negotiated profit margin. This structure created a perverse incentive. There was no reason to save money. There was no penalty for inefficiency. In fact, the more money Bechtel spent, the more profit it made. The $680 million was just the initial award. It was a down payment. Bechtel's mission was vast. It was tasked with rebuilding everything: the power grids, the water treatment plants, the sewage systems, the schools, the hospitals, and the port of Qasr. It was in effect a repeat of the Jubail project in Saudi Arabia, but with one critical difference. This time, they were building in a war zone with a blank check from the U.S. taxpayer. The first project was a massive PR stunt, the reopening of the port at Qasr. This was vital for bringing in humanitarian aid and military supplies. Bechtel was given the contract, and they quickly declared it a success, a symbol of liberation. But on the ground, reports surfaced immediately of gross overbilling and inefficiency. The project was a simple one, but it set the template for what was to come. As Bechtel's managers flooded the green zone in Baghdad, that initial $680 million contract began to swell. Within months, as Bechtel's teams assessed the damage, they found more and more things to fix. By 2007, that single no-bid contract had ballooned to an astonishing $2.3 billion. The results were a catastrophe of waste, fraud, and failure. The Special Inspector General for Iraq Reconstruction, SIGIR, a U.S. government watchdog agency, was established to audit this river of money. Its reports, published over the next decade, are a devastating indictment of the Bechtel model. They paint a picture not of a company struggling in a war zone, but of a company actively profiting from a system with zero accountability. The total U.S. fund for Iraq's reconstruction was a staggering $18.4 billion. A 2007 congressional audit would later conclude that the vast majority of this money had been wasted or lost to corruption. Bechtel was the single largest recipient of this waste. Take the schools. Bechtel was tasked with building and rehabilitating over 150 schools. This was a critical hearts and minds mission. But as SIGIR auditors investigated, they found a disaster. A $19 million project for a children's hospital in Basra was so poorly constructed that it was a catastrophic failure, with raw sewage leaking into the wards. Bechtel's response when questioned was to point to the difficult security situation. This became the universal excuse, but the SIGIR reports revealed a different story. It wasn't just the war, it was incompetence and a complete lack of oversight. In one notorious example, SIGIR auditors inspected a completed school that Bechtel had built. They found open trenches, exposed electrical wires, and collapsing ceilings. In another, they found a $1.2 million project to build a local police station that was so badly designed, the walls were literally crumbling. The auditors concluded it was unfit for use and would need to be demolished. This was not a failure to build, it was a failure to manage. Bechtel, as the primary contractor, was the head of the food chain. Its job was to distribute its $2.3 billion to a vast network of subcontractors. And in the chaotic gold rush atmosphere of post-invasion Iraq, this process was rife with corruption. A 2004 investigation by NBC News uncovered the reality of this system. Bechtel, it was found, had subcontracted critical work to firms that were themselves deeply compromised. In one case, a subcontractor hired by Bechtel was a firm that had just been fined $86 million in a separate U.S. case for fraudulent billing. Bechtel's vetting process was either non-existent or, more likely, irrelevant. The goal was to move the money, not to ensure it was being spent wisely or ethically. This created a system of double dipping. A subcontractor would bill Bechtel for a project. Bechtel would add its guaranteed profit and then bill USAID. But SIG-IR auditors found that the work itself was often never completed, or was completed with shoddy materials that would fall apart within months. A school would be rebuilt, but the new roof would leak, the walls would crack, and the electrical systems would be hazardous. Bechtel would get paid, the subcontractor would get paid, and the Iraqi children would be left with a building more dangerous than the one they had before. The social tragedy of this reconstruction was even deeper than the financial waste. While Bechtel's expatriate managers lived in the fortified, air-conditioned green zone in Baghdad, enjoying a lifestyle completely divorced from the country they were supposedly rebuilding, their projects were actively harming the Iraqi people. The most critical failures were in water and power. Bechtel was handed hundreds of millions of dollars to repair and upgrade Iraq's collapsing water treatment and electrical grids. These were not hearts and minds projects. They were a matter of life and death. The result was a humanitarian disaster. The power grid, despite Bechtel's repairs, remained sporadic, leaving Iraqis to swelter in 120-degree heat. But the water system was the true catastrophe. Bechtel's completed water treatment plants were, in many cases, non-functional. They failed to add chlorine, a basic step, or pumped contaminated water directly into the public supply. In 2007, a massive cholera outbreak swept through Iraq. The World Health Organization reported that over 7,000 people were infected, a disease spread almost entirely by contaminated water. The very water system that Bechtel had been paid $2.3 billion to fix was now poisoning the population. The financial social tragedy, as one auditor had called it, was now a public health emergency. This was the war contractor model in action. It was not about rebuilding a nation. It was about the transfer of wealth. It was a system designed to take billions from the U.S. Treasury and deliver it to the shareholders of a private, politically connected corporation, with the destroyed nation of Iraq serving as little more than a cost-plus processing fee. The human cost of this business model was not limited to the Iraqi people. It was also paid by Bechtel's own workforce, specifically the cheap, expendable third country nationals, or TCNs. To maximize profits, Bechtel and its subcontractors relied on a shadow army of laborers from the Philippines, India, Pakistan, and Nepal. These men were lured from their home countries with promises of high-paying American jobs. When they arrived in the war zone, they found a different reality. Labor rights groups and journalists began to document the horrific conditions. These TCNs were often housed in squalid, overcrowded camps, their passports seized by subcontractors to prevent them from leaving. They were, in effect, indentured servants, trapped in a war zone. The safety standards that supposedly governed Bechtel's projects were, for these men, non-existent. A 2004 NBC News report documented the deaths of at least 50 contract workers on Bechtel's projects. These were the invisible men who were actually building the reconstruction, dying from mortar attacks, convoy ambushes, heat stroke, and industrial accidents. Their deaths were rarely reported, just another cost of doing business absorbed by the cost-plus contract. This was the Bechtel scandal that the Nautilus Institute had warned about. The company's political connections, its membership in elite circles, like the Bohemian Grove with the Bush family, had not just given it an opportunity, it had given it a license to fail upwards. The public relations response from Bechtel was a masterclass in corporate deflection. Facing mounting criticism from Siger, Congress, and the media, the company went on the offensive. It published its own glossy reports from the field, filled with smiling Iraqi children and testimonials from local leaders. It claimed that the SIGIR audits were bureaucratic nitpicking that failed to grasp the Herculean effort of building in a war zone. When references to the $18.4 billion in total reconstruction funds that had vanished, a figure cited in a 2007 congressional audit, were dismissed, Bechtel argued that its 10% share of that waste was a remarkable success given the circumstances. They portrayed themselves not as profiteers, but as patriots, braving insurgent attacks to deliver water and power to the Iraqi people. But the reality on the ground was undeniable. By 2007, Bechtel's contract was coming to an end. The company, citing mission accomplished, announced it was pulling out. The Guardian reported the stark contrast. Bechtel claimed 95% of its work was done, while government auditors could only verify 72%, with much of that being unusable. Bechtel had successfully built a Potemkin village in Iraq. It had constructed a facade of reconstruction, just long enough to collect its $2.3 billion, leaving behind a nation with a collapsed power grid, a poisoned water system, and a generation of Iraqis who now equated American reconstruction with corruption and failure. This, then, was the price of the revolving door. The shadow architects had fulfilled their role. They had taken the political connections forged by George Shultz and Caspar Weinberger and monetized them. They had turned the military's destruction into the world's most profitable construction site. It was the ultimate cost-plus contract. The Iraqi people paid the price in blood and cholera, the American taxpayer paid the price in billions, and Bechtel simply got paid. While Bechtel was solidifying its reputation as the U.S. government's indispensable partner in war zones, a different story was unfolding back home. The company's operations in Iraq, while shielded by the chaos of conflict, were not an aberration. They were an echo. The culture of waste, mismanagement, and lethal negligence that defined the Iraq reconstruction was not born in the Green Zone. It was a business model that had been perfected for decades on American soil against the American taxpayer. Nowhere was this more evident than in Boston. The project was officially known as the Central Artery Sachichach Tunnel Project, but the world would come to know it as the Big Dig. It was, in the 1980s, the most ambitious and complex urban engineering project in American history, a plan to bury the city's main elevated highway in a massive underground tunnel. It was a project that perfectly matched Bechtel's reputation for tackling the impossible. And in 1984, a joint venture, Bechtel/Parsons-Brinkerhoff, was selected to be the lead manager of the entire sprawling endeavor. It became the single greatest financial boondoggle in the history of the United States. The Big Dig was a domestic echo of the Iraq reconstruction, a cost-plus contract on an unimaginable scale. But this time, the enemy was not an insurgency. It was Bechtel's own mismanagement. The project's initial budget when Bechtel took over was $2.8 billion. By the time the project was complete in 2007, the price tag, including interest, had ballooned to an incomprehensible $22 billion. It was a financial black hole that had swallowed the budgets of an entire state for a generation. The public, outraged by the decades of delays and the exploding costs, was told this was just the price of complex modern engineering. Then on the night of July 10, 2006, the financial scandal became a human tragedy. A concrete panel in the new E90 tunnel, A 12-ton slab of the ceiling secured by bolts Bechtel's team was responsible for inspecting tore free. It fell directly onto a passing car, crushing the passenger, Milena Del Valle, and killing her instantly. This was not a war zone. This was not a developing nation. This was Boston. The subsequent investigation was a devastating indictment of the Bechtel management model. Investigators found that the company had known about systematic failures in the tunnel. They found that the wrong, cheaper, and inappropriate epoxy had been used to secure the bolts. They found that Bechtel's managers had missed or ignored clear signs of structural failure, prioritizing deadlines and budgets over safety. It was the Iraq model brought home. It was a cost-plus contract that incentivized cutting corners, not ensuring quality. Bechtel, as the manager, was in charge of oversight. In effect, they were in charge of overseeing themselves. The result was a $14 billion cost overrun and a dead civilian. In 2012, to avoid a corporate manslaughter trial, Bechtel and its partners agreed to pay a massive $458 million settlement. It was a stunning admission of failure. The Big Dig proved that the Iraq debacle was not an anomaly. It demonstrated, inarguable, that Bechtel's core business tactic, managing massive public-funded cost-plus projects with minimal oversight, was a recipe for catastrophic financial waste and ultimately lethal negligence. But a tunnel collapse, while tragic, is a localized failure. For the true generational scale of Bechtel's malfeasance, one must travel to the high desert of Washington State to the Hanford site. This is the most toxic place in the Western Hemisphere. It is the plutonium factory Bechtel helped build for the Manhattan Project in 1943. It is a 580 square mile radioactive graveyard, holding 2/3 of America's high-level nuclear waste, a toxic stew of 56 million gallons of sludge in 177 aging underground tanks. In 1989, in a moment of supreme Orwellian irony, the U.S. government hired Bechtel, the company that had helped create the site, to be the lead contractor on the mission to clean it up. The project, with a budget that has swelled to over $40 billion, became Bechtel's new permanent cost-plus paradise. It was a contract that guaranteed profits, with no end in sight. Bechtel's job was to build a massive vitrification plant, a facility that would supposedly turn the liquid nuclear waste into solid, stable glass, a process known as vitrification. The Hanford cleanup, under Bechtel's management, has been a failure on a scale that dwarfs even the Big Dig. It is decades behind schedule, and its cost has more than quadrupled, with no end in sight. But this is not just a story of financial waste. It is a story of active, ongoing environmental catastrophe. In 2013, the U.S. Department of Energy, the agency paying Bechtel, delivered a bombshell report. A new tank, one Bechtel was responsible for, was leaking. An estimated 1 million gallons of high-level radioactive waste, a slurry of plutonium, cesium, and strontium, was seeping from the tank's inner shell. This was not a historical leak from the 1940s. This was a new, modern failure, happening under Bechtel's management. It was a direct result of the same corporate culture that had defined the Big Dig, a cost-plus system that incentivized cutting corners, ignoring safety protocols, and silencing whistleblowers. Whistleblowers at the site, who were later vindicated, had warned for years that Bechtel was using substandard materials and flawed designs for the new vitrification plant. They described a management culture that treated safety concerns as an obstacle to profit. The company, they alleged, was building a state-of-the-art facility that they knew would not work, all while billing the government billions for their expertise. The company's culture of making do The same culture that had failed in Iraq and Boston was now poisoning the land with plutonium. In 2020, the Department of Energy, in an unprecedented move, fined Bechtel $13 million for its chronic systemic failures and safety violations at the site. It was a tiny sum for a multi-billion-dollar project, but it was a formal admission. The shadow architect was not just incompetent, it was a threat to public health. This is not a victimless crime. The Hanford site sits on the banks of the Columbia River, the lifeblood of the Pacific Northwest. The contamination seeping into the groundwater threatens the sacred fisheries of the indigenous Yakama Nation, whose members, according to EPA studies, already suffer from mysteriously elevated rates of cancer and thyroid disease. Hanford is the perfect Bechtel loop. It is a story that begins with the company profiting from building the bomb and ends with it profiting again from failing to clean up the mess. The scandals at the Big Dig in Hanford were slow-burn tragedies, complex tales of financial waste and invisible toxins. But in the year 2000, Bechtel's new privatization model produced a crisis that was immediate, violent, and perfectly clear: the Bolivia Water War. The city was Cochabamba, a poor, arid community in the Andes. The World Bank, as a condition for future loans, had pressured the Bolivian government to privatize its public water system. In 1999, a Bechtel-led consortium, Aguas del Tunari, was the only bidder. They were granted a 40-year monopoly concession. This secret backroom deal was a textbook example of corporate extortion. The contract not only guaranteed the consortium a 16% annual profit, it also gave them control of all water. This included the community wells that poor farmers had dug themselves, and in a detail of almost surreal corporate greed, it even gave them the rights to the rain. It was now illegal for citizens to collect rainwater from their own roofs. Bechtel's first act as owner was to raise the water rates, not by a small amount, but by an average of 50%, with some of the poorest residents seeing their bills spike by 200%. The reaction was immediate. This was not a population that could absorb such a blow. Families earning $100 a month were handed $20 water bills. It was a choice between water and food. The city exploded. Tens of thousands of people, teachers, farmers, students, and factory workers, poured into the streets. This was not a protest. It was a popular uprising. They were led by a shoemaker named Oscar Oliveira, who became the face of a global fight against privatization. The Bechtel-backed Bolivian government responded with violence. They declared martial law. They sent the military into the streets, firing live ammunition at the protesters. 6 people were killed, including a 17-year-old boy named Victor Hugo Daza, who was shot in the face. The water war became a global cause célèbre, the image of a multi-billion-dollar American corporation using a client state's military to shoot civilians over the right to drink water was a public relations disaster. After months of bloody conflict, the government collapsed. The protesters won. In April 2000, the Bolivian government canceled the contract. Bechtel's executives were forced to flee the city. But for Bechtel, the scandal was not over. Their investment had failed, so they turned to their legal playbook. The corporation, through its Dutch subsidiary, filed a $25 million lawsuit against the government of Bolivia, one of the poorest countries in the world. In a secret, corporate-friendly tribunal housed at the World Bank, the ICSID, they were suing the public for the lost profits they had expected to make. It was the final arrogant act. The lawsuit dragged on for 6 years, a symbol of corporate impunity. It was only in 2006, after a global campaign of shaming, that Bechtel finally agreed to drop the suit. accepting a token, symbolic payment of 30 cents. The Bolivia water war, the Big Dig, and the Hanford leaks were not isolated incidents. They were the same story told in different languages. They were the direct result of a business model that prioritized guaranteed cost-plus profits and legal insulation above all else, above public safety, above environmental health, and above the basic human right to life. For a family that has physically remade the planet, the greatest Bechtel engineering project may be its own invisibility. Unlike the flamboyant public dynasties of American life, the Rockefellers, the Kennedys, or the Murdochs, the Bechtels do not produce public-facing scandals. There are no tabloid affairs, no drug-addicted heirs fighting over the inheritance, no messy public divorces. Their personal lives are a black box, a void. The family is and has always been pathologically discreet. The personal tragedies that mark the Bechtel line, therefore, are not domestic. They are corporate. They happen in the service of the company, and they are managed with the same cold, unsentimental efficiency as a construction project. Take the founder, Warren A. Bechtel. He didn't die of old age in a warm bed, surrounded by family. He died fittingly in the middle of a deal. In 1933, at the age of 60, he was in Moscow. He was deep in negotiations with the new Soviet government, attempting to secure massive contracts to build the infrastructure of a communist state. He died suddenly of a heart attack in his hotel room, an empire builder expiring at the very frontier of his ambition. His son, Stephen Bechtel Sr., had to fly to Russia to retrieve his body. The lesson was clear. The business was the life. Stephen Sr. learned this lesson well. He was the true shadow. He presided over the company's greatest expansion, its move into the Middle East, its partnership with the OSS and CIA, and its entry into the nuclear age. He was, for a time, one of the most powerful men in the world. But after passing control to his son, Stephen Jr., in 1960, he fully embraced the family's code of secrecy, retreating into privacy until his death in 1989. But it was his son, Stephen Bechtel Jr., who truly perfected the vanishing act. After decades of running the empire, in 1990, at the height of his own power, he simply vanished. Citing health reasons, Stephen Jr. resigned from the board of the company his grandfather had founded. He retreated into a life of absolute privacy. He lived for 31 more years, dying in 2021, having successfully and completely erased himself from the public record. He was a ghost who had once commanded the world. His personal tragedy was not a fall from grace. It was a deliberate, successful retreat into the obscurity the family craved. This cultivated invisibility is what made the tenure of his son, Riley P. Bechtel, so jarring for the family. Riley was the Bechtel who finally got caught in the light. He was the CEO who presided over the two most toxic scandals in the company's history, the Iraq War reconstruction and the Big Dig. For the first time, the criticism wasn't just about an abstract corporation. It became personal. Riley Bechtel was the war profiteer. He was the man whose company's faulty tunnel had killed a woman in Boston. He was the one heckled by activists and hounded by journalists. The family's protective wall of secrecy had been breached. In 2014, after years of this intense negative public scrutiny, Riley P. Bechtel, the man who had faced down Congress, stepped down from the CEO role, also citing health reasons. Whether the illness was real or a convenient corporate excuse, the result was the same. It was a familiar Bechtel move, a necessary retreat from the toxic glare of public scrutiny that the family had for a century so masterfully avoided. This retreat, however, did not mean a loss of control. The Bechtel dynasty's most effective tactic has always been its seamless, almost monarchical line of succession. While the family remained obsessively private, their control over the corporation remained absolute. This created a different kind of personal tragedy, the tragedy of the non-family employee. For a century, Bechtel has been roiled by internal disputes not from shareholders, there are none, but from its own workforce. During the boom and bust cycles of the engineering world, Bechtel's model was to hire tens of thousands of workers for massive projects and then, when the projects were complete or a recession hit, to fire them en masse. This happened most dramatically in the 1980s recession, when the company laid off thousands. A 1985 lawsuit, though ultimately unsuccessful, was filed by laid-off employees who argued they had been terminated without cause, while the family continued to pay itself millions. The internal culture, as described by former employees, was one of feudal loyalty. The company was a kingdom, and the Bechtels were the kings. This dynamic came to a head in 2016. When Riley Bechtel stepped down, the CEO position did not go to a seasoned, non-family executive who had worked their way up for decades. It went to his son, Brendan Bechtel. Brendan, the fifth generation, was handed the reins of the $22 billion empire. This anointing was a clear message to the 55,000 employees. This is and will always be a family business. But Brendan inherited a company that was, for the first time, facing serious criticism for its prioritization of profit over safety. Activist groups like CorpWatch, citing the Big Dig and Hanford failures, accused the new young CEO of inheriting a culture of impunity, one that he was unlikely to change. The family's public response to these generations of scandals has been a calculated, massive public relations and philanthropic offensive. The Bechtel Foundation, established in the 1950s, has become one of the most powerful philanthropic forces in the world, particularly in STEM education. This is not simple charity. It is a sophisticated business strategy. By donating hundreds of millions of dollars, over $350 million in the 2020s alone, to engineering schools, universities, and museums, the family accomplishes two goals. First, it sanitizes the Bechtel name, associating it not with war, profiteering, or nuclear leaks, but with innovation, science, and a brighter future. Second, it directly funds the pipeline of the next generation of engineers, the very people who will come to work for and be loyal to the Bechtel Corporation. But this philanthropy is as secretive as the family itself. As noted by groups like Transparency International, Bechtel, as a private company, is not required to file detailed public financial reports. It's impossible to know the true scale of their profits, their executive compensation, or the exact nature of their political spending. The personal tragedy of the Bechtel dynasty, then, is that after a century of building the world, their primary engineering project is now the maintenance of their own secrecy, a multi-billion-dollar wall to hide the true cost of their power. The secrecy that Bechtel has cultivated for over a century has created an aura of mystery, making it a natural subject for conspiracy theories. The most potent of these center on the company's uncanny ability to be in the right place at the right time. Reports in the LA Times and other outlets have long pointed to the Bohemian Grove, the exclusive, all-male encampment where Bechtel executives like George Shultz and Caspar Weinberger mingled with figures like the Bush family. Critics allege that it was here, in the shadows of the redwoods, that the lucrative no-bid contracts for the Iraq War were pre-arranged, long before the first bombs fell. Other theories are even darker, tracing back to the company's origins as a shadow government contractor. Persistent rumors detailed by researchers at Marxist.org and others link Stephen Bechtel Sr.'s work with the OSS directly to the 1953 CIA-led coup in Iran that overthrew the democratically elected Prime Minister Mossadegh. The theory holds that Bechtel's intelligence gathering helped pave the way for the coup, which in turn opened up Iran's vast oil fields to Western corporations, including Bechtel. But the reality of Bechtel's power, as many historians and experts like Simon Johnson have argued, is far more open, systemic, and ultimately more damning than any secret plot. The true influence is not conspiracy, it is soft power, and it operates in plain sight. Bechtel doesn't need a secret plot to get government contracts. This is a company that, by its own estimates, has built or helped build half of all 20th century nuclear and electrical infrastructure in the United States. It is not an outside contractor. It is the system. The revolving door is not a theory. It is a documented fact. When George Shultz left his post as Bechtel's president, he became the U.S. Secretary of State. But when he left that post, he didn't just retire. He took a position at the Hoover Institution, a think tank that spent decades creating the very neoliberal privatization policies that Bechtel would later use to profit from ventures like the Bolivia water war. This is the Bechtel loop. One generation of executives enters government to create the policy, and the next generation profits from it. Ultimately, historians and investigators like those at CorpWatch argue that focusing on secret plots at Bohemian Grove misses the point. The true scandal is not that Bechtel's business model is a secret, it's that it is publicly known. Profiting from war, as seen in Iraq, is not a conspiracy. It is the reconstruction sector. Profiting from public utilities, as seen in Bolivia, is not a backroom deal. It is the privatization model. The story of Bechtel is therefore a complex lesson in the blurred lines of a modern corporate state. It demonstrates how a private, family-owned company, through a century of cultivated relationships, political access, and engineering prowess, effectively became a permanent, unaccountable branch of the U.S. government. The system itself, which allows private profit to be the primary motive for rebuilding a nation or delivering its water, is the real shadow architecture they built.